Algorithms are finicky bastards, and so even if you're subscribed to me, even if you've clicked the bell and gone through all the other rigmarole, even if you follow me on social media, you might not see what I'm up to. So I have a mailing list. Postmortem-studios-fan-group, which is a bit of a mouthful, but all you have to do is navigate your way there once at groups.google.com and subscribe, and then once a month you will get an email with everything that I've done in the previous month. And isn't that special? Privyet Milier. So today we're not looking at a D&D book. I know, gasp, shock, horror. We're looking at Starfinder, so I'm easing you back into non-D&D and non-D&D related material, step by step, I guess. Starfinder is quite underrated, I think. Now, it is a kind of game that I don't necessarily like, in which you just take all the fantasy tropes and ideas and you transpose them into a different setting. I don't like Shadowrun, because I don't like essentially D&D cyberpunk. And while Starfinder has certain aspects of that, somehow it has its own charm in a way that, at least for me, Shadowrun doesn't. Starfinder seems to be fighting for its identity and for reasonable sales, and if you preferred 3rd edition D&D over 5th edition D&D, but you thought that Pathfinder got a bit too bloated and complicated, Starfinder strips things back a bit. I haven't looked at Pathfinder 2nd edition, so I couldn't answer you on that one, but it strips it back a bit in terms of simplicity and accessibility, but not as far as 5th edition did, which you can regard as a mistake or not. It's all a matter of degree. One of the things that was always a bit more lackluster about Starfinder, however, was the Starship combat. Starship combat tended to take a very long time if you were doing small sort of ship on ship or ship on couple of ships actions, as you might in the same way that you would do interpersonal encounters. Combat encounters, like a group of adventurers, 4 to 6 characters against, maybe up to 3 times as many enemies. Starships, you're going to be tending to be one starship that's a player starship against one other or multiple other enemy starships. It just tended to drag, and it could be very hard using the rules as written to maneuver your ship into position to actually make an attack on the enemy, and so you would go around in circles for a very long time and not get very much accomplished. The rules as originally written do provide for characters to do things on board, so it's not just the pilot and the gunner who can do things, everyone can contribute. If you play using Theatre of the Mind rather than boards, the issues with Starfinder's ship combat were less obvious. You could work around them a bit more, but if you were playing the rules as written, certainly starships were a bit lackluster. Starship combat was a bit lackluster. Part of this is a problem of being a legacy game from D&D, and I've struggled with this myself, trying to deal with it in Machinations of the Space Princess. White Star, I think, also as a sort of OSR-ish derived game, struggles a bit. And the problem is that D&D has always been shit at handling vehicles in any sort of way, shape or form, ships, anything else, because of the way that characters and monsters and so on level and objects don't. It was very hard to model objects and fortifications and vehicles, even just carts, ships, whatever, in D&D, which is why it kind of tends to be a hand-wavium situation in a lot of D&D games. One way you can deal with it is to treat them as monsters. Again, Starfinder kind of comes halfway between treating ships as monsters or characters and treating them as objects, and as a result, it kind of works but kind of doesn't in a lot of ways. So part of the problem that I think Starfinder has from the get-go is that science fiction games, obviously equipment, vehicles, ships, those sorts of things, they're far more important and they're far more integral to the game than they are in fantasy games, where your primary mode of transport is going to be a horse or some other riding animal, which can be treated as a monster or a creature easily enough. But where a cart, how much damage can a cart take? Can you take out a cart by firing arrows at it until it runs out of hit points? Conceptually, that doesn't make any sense. You just end up with a working cart that was a pincushion of arrows. So the rules are a problem. The rules that Starfinder is derived from, it's a problem, and so on. It's quite frustrating. Why am I spending so long laying out the groundwork? Because it's kind of important. And I think Starfinder went 2/3 of the way towards solving the issue, but then didn't quite go far enough, which is why I think this book is quite necessary. It's more of a patch than reassessing the issue, but you do get a lot more options. You get more options for ship designs and so on. So I wouldn't play Starfinder as Starfinder. I would use it as a more rules-heavy version of the way I run Machinations of the Space Princess, but having more in-depth ship creation and design rules, more ship equipment and so on. That's great. So you can now, with these rules, I think you can model just about anything that you would care to model in Starfinder. You can take a ship from science fiction and you can pretty much build it now in Starfinder if you have this. It's less hung up on the conventions of the background that they've created for Starfinder. Maybe they're recognizing that people are going to be using this as a toolkit to run other kinds of science fiction game, and that's why they've moved to expand the options, different FTL drives, different options and things that you can hook onto your ship. I mean, if you wanted to make Outlaw Star, you've now got robotic appendages for your vehicles, so you could have your ship go up and punch another one if you wanted. You could design ships more like Mecha if you wanted. Yeah, there are options now, so I mean, there's no point going into excessive detail on everything that's offered, but it's just there. It is hugely expanded in terms of what you can have on your ship, in your ship, different ways of going about things, a whole new class of starships, super colossal starships. You can make things like Death Stars and Executor class Star Destroyers and so on. So, that's a good quarter to a third of the book is expanded options for design, which is great. It's additions. It doesn't solve necessarily the problems in the book, the original book, but it does give you more options. Okay, so then we move on to Starship Combat. Starship Combat is where I had most of the hang-ups that I have with Starfinder seem to exist around Starship Combat, and so this expands the options and gives players more things that they can do. There are different officer actions, so it expands the things that you can do as part of the ship, which helps deal with some of those situations where you ended up doing endlessly long combats just trying to maneuver to get off a shot, and then you'd have to get another one, and by the time you got back into position maybe they'd repaired some of the damage and so on. It just became interminable in small ship on ship actions. So this helps. It doesn't completely cure the problem, but it helps, and it allows for critical effects when you're trying to do something to help the ship. So that does introduce a bit more randomness, a bit more opportunity if you're using the rules as written to deal with the issues that come up in the original form of the Starship Combat. Some options for putting together starship chases, which also helps solve some of the issue, because often you're trying to escape or whatever from one to the other. Additional options for the ships, new officers and what they can do, some more guidance on repairs and so on. It's just a lot better and handles a lot of the situations that weren't necessarily spelled out at all or very well spelled out. You can speed up combat by doing squadron-based combat. That helps a lot if you've got lots of small ships against big ships, or lots of enemy ships against your player character ship. Armada scale battles, so that's the equivalent of doing mass scale battles in sort of interpersonal scale. So that's useful. There are plenty of options here, and yeah, basically this plus what's in the original book gives you a much more rounded, much more capable set of rules for handling both the design and creation of spaceships and making the combat work and run a bit faster. Then we're into the kind of sort of standard stuff that you get in any expansion book. We've got different corporations and groups that build ships of various kinds. NPC Starship crew modifiers, and then stat blocks for ships. So if you're not familiar with Starfinder, you can see here that they share a lot of their statistics with creatures. Speed is equivalent of movement, maneuverability, it's kind of like an acrobatics or athletic skill, armor class is familiar, and hit points and so on. Of course, these are at scale, so 30 hit points for a starship is not the same as 30 hit points for a creature. Yeah, you get the idea. So we've got plenty more styles and types of ship. They seem to have particularly expanded on the basic kinds of ship that you might just drop into your campaign as a player character ship, and also much more expanded the kind of things that would be enemy ships. Ships, you see, have a kind of challenge level, which is the problem with class and level systems anyway. But if you're going to do a class and level system, extending that into the starships and so on and their threat levels, makes reasonable sense. Plus, you can always beef up the lower level ones by giving them elite crews and so on. But yeah, you've got plenty of options. I think it's worth noting, just as I flip through these starship options, that one of my main criticisms of 5th edition is that it has boring presentation, muddy artwork. There isn't a lot of character and style that really kind of leaps out from 5th edition. Starfinder, I haven't looked at Pathfinder in a very long time, but at least it used to have a much more stylistic vision, a much more appealing, exaggerated, visually engaging presentation. Starfinder has all this kind of computery looking stuff, which ties into the setting, but also presents things in a useful way. They have these useful tabs down the side that help you figure out what chapter you're in. Just the for want of a better term, the user interface of Starfinder books is a lot better than I think 5th edition stuff is. And even your sort of bog standard, typical, standardized role-playing game art page just has something more appealing to it than a lot of the 5th edition stuff. I think it's the feeling of dynamism, that something is really happening in this image. All the characters are caught mid-movement, the ships are caught mid-movement, there's an explosion, there's a laser blast. It's more kinetic and engaging. There's stuff going on, there's not just people kind of stood there. But my bias against 5th edition art is pretty entrenched at this point. It's not the individual artists. I know it's not the individual artists because I know some of them, so it must be the brief and the art direction for 5th edition is just... it's just not there, I guess. Then we get into these big creatures. That illustration is probably not appropriate for one about starship creatures. But you can now have the rules laid out for making starship scale monstrosities. Of course, the line between creature and starship can be a bit blurred. You could probably make the Lex using this. Then you have lots of options for these things, like haunted spaceships that now run themselves, gigantic space jellyfish, hungry planetoids, you name it. That's it. Some of these are fun. Not if you're running a more sort of hard science fiction game, but I mean, even Star Trek had its gigantic and weird space creatures, so it's certainly a trope, even within harder science fiction, to have Void Kraken or something similar. There's a nice section on space hazards, and yeah, this is a cinematic space universe, so you're going to have Star Wars style asteroid belts, not real ones where they're spaced out by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers from each other at the very least. Some tips on running stuff. See what I mean about characterful art? Pathfinder has always had very characterful goblins, and that goes just as well for space goblins. Adventure seeds, big fan of adventure seeds, always useful, just gives you enough of an idea to go on and make your own thing. So we're pretty much there. They've got some sheets and stuff in the back, nice and useful. They've got their adventure paths, which aren't useful for me, but some people like them. But still. So, definitely a very useful book if you play Starfinder at all. And if you don't play Starfinder, it is a game that is worth looking at, certainly, in my opinion. Even though I wouldn't use it as written in terms of the background and so on, the rules, etc. are pretty solid, with the exception of the Starship rules, which this goes a long way towards correcting. In terms of style, it's not particularly standout from the Starfinder line, but Starfinder has better art on what must be a somewhat similar sort of budget and timescale to what 5th edition does. They're not quite the powerhouse they used to be, the Pathfinder guys, Paizo, but they are up there still in terms of game providers. So I think a direct comparison between Wizards of the Coast and Paizo is more warranted than it would be for any other company. And in comparison to Wizards of the Coast, the art direction, the style, the writing and so on, I find far more engaging in Starfinder. So style 4, decent artwork, decent writing. Substance, I mean, this is a book that is all substance, and it covers pretty much everything that you need. And it's useful beyond the basic background of Starfinder. So if you play Starfinder, then I think this is an essential book. I can't really fault it in terms of the content, except that I think it doesn't go far enough in some instances, but I can see why they wouldn't want to completely overhaul Starship combat and statistics. So I will actually give it a 5 out of 5 for content. So that's style 4. Substance 5, 9 out of 10, 4.5 out of 5. If you play Starfinder, this is essential. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.